The Last of Us is a fantastic entertainment product. It's not an unparalleled story or an extraordinary game, but as a whole package it does contain a great story and some great gameplay. It's important to make the distinction right off the bat, because I believe The Last of Us can be quite cleanly divided. Outside of a select few moments, the story is not enhanced by being told in a video game, and the gameplay is not enhanced by the story being told, but neither do the two compromise each other. They don't harmonise, but they do make for a fantastic duet. I feel like I have to reinforce that distinction, since the story in The Last of Us is one of the most overanalyzed in gaming history. I'll be critiquing the design of The Last of Us as a game, just as with the rest of my videos. I'll be looking at it as a set of systems, rules, and mechanics. Also, to preface the gameplay footage, I've played through The Last of Us upwards of 10 times since it released, so I decided to push it to the limit and do this particular playthrough on grounded difficulty with no health kits. Some extra footage was played on hard to demonstrate a few features which are removed on the highest difficulty. When the heads up display is present, that's hard mode. When it's not, that's grounded. It's never failed me before, so let's start by dividing The Last of Us into its constituent parts. Combat, which can be either stealth or third-person shooting combined with human enemies or zombies. Story, including an abundance of walking and talking sections. And puzzles, which are incredibly rare and take up maybe 20 minutes of a 15-hour playtime. They're so insignificant that for the sake of focus, I'm not going to comment on them here. That's not much of a list. I've already given the extent of my comment on the story, so really all that leaves me to work with is the combat. It's a good thing the combat systems in The Last of Us are superb. I judged the Uncharted games harshly on depth, or lack thereof. I said that to my tastes, I consider it extremely important for games to give the player distinct, relevant options or choices during gameplay, and said that this can be split into two distinct components. The first was the obvious, mechanical depth, giving the player a lot of distinct, relevant options in their moveset or weapon loadout, the things they have direct control over. The second was one I coined myself, situational depth, creating distinct, relevant gameplay scenarios which make the player use that set of mechanics in different ways. Situational depth in The Last of Us is easy to illustrate. It's a bunch of building blocks. Most encounters can be completed with stealth, gunplay, or a mixture of the two. Enemies are either humans or infected. The two don't overlap in the main game, but we'll see at some point that the way these enemies work actually means they cancel each other out anyway. At this point we can then add enemy types. For zombies, runners are your standard berserker, clickers can't see but have super sensitive hearing, bloaters have armor plating and ranged attacks, and stalkers have the sight of a runner and the hearing of a clicker. Human types are less defined, all of them can wear body armor, but there's definitely separation between guys with pistols, rifles, melee weapons, and molotovs. From here we can start constructing combat encounters. A room with 3 runners and 2 clickers, a hotel complex with 5 riflemen, 7 gunslingers, 2 bartenders, 2 plumbers, and a partridge in a pear tree. Give 5 of them body armor at random and you can see just how many ways these individual parts can be combined. The situations with the most depth let you choose to ghost or fight your way through all of them, but at the same time a few scenarios where you have to fight or have to sneak are good ways to add variety, in the case that the player's been favouring one or the other. This kind of puzzle piece design creates a deeper combat system because the player's mechanics, the weapon loadout, remains constant, but every single one of these elements forces the player to think about using those mechanics differently. You need to approach a rifleman in full body armor very differently to a melee enemy. You move very differently around a clicker coupled with a runner than you would around 2 Molotov dudes. After building all these pieces, it's just a matter of combining them in a bunch of different and interesting ways. As for those mechanics themselves, as I say, The Last of Us's combat systems can be neatly broken into stealth and open combat. I think the best way to demonstrate just how much is going on here will be to quickly go through everything. First, the backpack, and here we have the obvious, handguns and long guns, which work largely as you'd expect if you've played a handful of shooters. The pistol does the least damage, the revolver is powerful with massive recoil, the Diablo has a scope, the shorty is a one-handed shotgun. The shotgun is a shotgun, the hunting rifle does massive damage, The flamethrower has a tiny range but can burn off mushroom armor, and the bow is silent unless you miss and is a parabolic projectile instead of hit scan. Since you can carry all of these weapons at once, ammo scarcity takes on the job of forcing weapon switching often on higher difficulties, so you can never get too comfortable with just a couple of weapons. There is some overlap here. The only difference between the function of the shorty and shotgun is range, and if you've pulled out a shotgun, range probably isn't your biggest concern. The Diablo and hunting rifle are both very powerful weapons with scopes. I imagine the Diablo is only here because players can miss out on crafting a scope onto the rifle. Still, outside of these two cases, all the weapons are noticeably distinct and relevant. They serve different functions, function differently, and all have pros and cons to their use. The other options in the backpack include smoke bombs, nail bombs, and molotovs. Nail bombs can be placed as proximity mines to catch patrolling humans off guard. Infected will wander blindly into flame, and enemies won't shoot through smoke. Smoke bombs aside, these grenade types succeed in having distinct uses while also being somewhat useful in every scenario. A Molotov may be more useful in taking out a pack of clickers, but nothing's stopping you from using one on a single human enemy either. On top of this, Joel has his fists, sometimes a melee weapon which can kill in one hit if upgraded, and a handful of shivs for quick stealth kills. If you've only played the game once, you may not be aware of the full potential of bricks and bottles. Bottles make a louder noise when thrown to attract enemies, but don't do much damage as a melee weapon, only stunning the enemy. Bricks have a smaller noisemaker radius, but can kill any human or runner enemy in 3 short whacks. You can only carry one of these at once, one brick or one bottle, so even this choice has consequences. Now let's have a look at the inventory screen in Uncharted. My apologies if just listing a bunch of the gameplay features is a bit obvious, but the majority of my praise for the gameplay in The Last of Us can be summed up neatly by saying, The Last of Us is somewhat deep. Not exactly a brilliant, insightful conclusion that'll inspire games critique for years to come, but it is the core of my enjoyment. The Last of Us gives you a bunch of balanced combat options, then gives you varied, challenging scenarios to use them in. There's so much potential which is actually capitalized on, and there's really no better conclusion than that. Every enemy and offensive option changes the way you play the game. Every option has at least one scenario where it's the ideal solution, aside from perhaps the smoke bombs, even down to the bricks and bottles on Grounded. Options can be used effectively or poorly depending on skill, body shots versus headshots, or catching 5 enemies with a nail bomb instead of 1. And options can be used in conjunction with each other to create even more opportunities. For example, bloaters can be set on fire to burn off their mushroom armor before laying into their squishy bits with bullets. And of course, everything you can craft stops you from crafting something else. This, coupled with the real-time crafting menu, forces you to read a situation wisely before you make a choice. Of course, this isn't to say The Last of Us couldn't have benefited from being even deeper. While giving the player more weapons makes the combat inherently deeper, when elements can't overlap or affect each other, adding more stuff can become depth for the sake of depth. Many people would call this breadth. I think The Last of Us avoids including anything thoughtlessly, aside from perhaps the shorty, but there are even more ways these weapons could have interacted. Burning mushrooms off bloaters before attacking with bullets is a good start, but that's as far as it gets. How about shooting an enemy through the leg with an arrow, slowing their movement for a cleaner headshot with the revolver? Or if we want to get really dark, blowing someone's lower leg off with the shotgun, making them a smaller target when they fall to the floor, but opening them up for a mercy kill up close, as it is in the multiplayer. More on that much later. Perhaps a machete kill could allow you to stab a guy right through the chest, then leave him on the blade as you pull out your revolver and drag him around as a human shield. These are just examples I can think of that would still fit the game's tone. If Naughty Dog were to aim to please me, because I can really only speak for my own tastes here, I'd like to see interactions like this between every type of weapon. Disregarding tone, the main problem here is in finding ways to combine the effects of the very similar generic hit-scan weapons like the pistol and rifle. So in open combat, all the options work as described, but in stealth a few elements take on different meanings. As long as you aren't spotted, you can grab an enemy from behind, and from here you have, options. You can stealth kill him, or drag him around with a gun to his head as a human shield in an attempt to get some shots on the other enemies. Even then though, you've got other things to worry about. Enemies will do their best to flank intelligently, and your human shield only works in one direction, so you can drop him with a couple whacks to the head or with a bullet. I'm usually inclined towards stealth, so the cons here outweigh the pros for me, but it's cool to have this kind of standoff as a buffer between stealth and a full-on firefight. Other than that, enemies also have last known location intelligence, so as long as you're able to break line of sight, dropping back into stealth is as smooth as going loud. All of that is to say nothing about the level design of the combat encounters. The variety makes me wonder about what the initial goal was here: believable environments or functional combat arenas. Aside from the beginning of the game, which is kind of blatant about its design to ease in a wide audience, nothing here feels like it was built to be a combat arena. There are a bunch of pedestrian locations which Joel just so happens to have a fight in. As such, they can range from an incredibly linear sewage drain to a confusing, multi-layered hotel complex reminiscent of the first Max Payne, with no particular rhyme or reason. As such, the amount of options each arena provides is also totally unpredictable, although the vast majority of encounters will give at least 3 possible angles of approach. Early on in the game, in one of the most linear hallways it has to offer, you can still flank left through some adjacent rooms and an office. Later on, you'll find spots to stop and snipe, and in the hotel it's easy to get hopelessly lost, weaving in and out of the bedrooms. In my opinion, the key job of level design in a linear shooter is to provide enough options for the player to try something new every time they die, within reason. A game is only truly a corridor shooter when your approach is limited to a corridor. Banging your head against a wall is only sympathetic if there's no door. In the case of The Last of Us, I think it does this adequately, but it's fair to say that most of the options of approach come from all the different mechanical choices the player has, rather than from phenomenal level design. Of course, options are for nothing if the AI can't keep up with the intricacies of Joel's abilities, and this is the area where The Last of Us has received the most criticism. To quickly address the dumb companion AI, which will often walk in front of enemies, I don't care. The companions are 90% of the time a gameplay non-element, only there for the sake of plot, and I've been playing games for long enough that I can filter this stuff out. I'm not so worried about the atmosphere of a game that this stuff bothers me. What does bother me, however, is when the stupidity of the enemy AI begins to have an effect on the gameplay. The enemies are definitely not a non-element, so when they show equal levels of failed comprehension, it begins to suggest missed gameplay opportunities. To steal a turn of phrase from Ego Raptor, the closer you get to reality, the more you have to stipulate. In the case of The Last of Us, the game is trying to be realistic about violence, so when AIs do stupid things that no human would ever do in the middle of a battle, it sticks out where it would be totally forgiven in, Transformers Fall of Cybertron. Great game. A lot of people get understandably hung up on this in terms of immersion, as with the friendly AI, but when an enemy runs at me with a plank of wood while I have my shotgun aimed at his face, it makes me think about how a more realistic reaction could lead to more interesting gameplay. This is an issue of how rigid these human enemy types are. Melee enemies are useless on the battlefield when you're keeping your distance and picking enemies off one by one with the rifle. If this enemy could pull out a pistol under certain circumstances, the other enemies could give him cover fire until he got close enough to pull his pipe out again. There's nothing particularly challenging about shooting a guy who's bull rushing you. There's something a lot more satisfying about getting the better of a guy who knows to pull out his revolver when the pipe approach just isn't going to cut it. Dividing enemies into different types by weaponry makes a lot of sense, but limiting an enemy to Molotovs when the player has this many options makes them totally pathetic, even on the highest difficulty. In this case, I think a more realistic AI is a goal that would serve both atmosphere and gameplay. Sadly, you don't have to go very far to find a game that once did exactly this. The Last of Us's original gameplay reveal featured an extensive demonstration of the balance of power system. Enemies were extremely intelligent and knew when they had the upper hand. It'll probably never be known for sure if the game actually worked like this at some point, or if this was just amazingly tightly choreographed. I'm judging the game I played, not an E3 gameplay trailer, so I won't dwell on this, but it's always disappointing when developers provide the measuring stick which makes their own final product look substandard. For more on this, Hyperbit Hero's got another video well worth your time. Still, that's not to say the AI in The Last of Us is terrible. In fact, it was often pretty damn impressive at the time of the game's release. The fact that enemies can react intelligently to this scenario is an achievement in itself. Again, it's all about perception. Uncharted can get away with little to no comment on its AI, even in my video now I think about it, because it was never about tactics and options, it was an action-packed rollercoaster ride. The Last of Us aims in a lot of ways for realism, so any stupid behaviours conflict with that and stick out. You could even say that criticising The Last of Us for inconsistent AI means Naughty Dog is doing something right. It has to be mostly convincing for the times when it's idiotic to stand out. In the end, AI has a long way to go if games are going to keep striving for realism. Some games can make simple AI patterns work in their favour, but if every game were Mario, I'd imagine we'd be pretty sick of Goombas. In the case of The Last of Us, I think more realistic AI would have enhanced gameplay as well as atmosphere, and this is one area where I think certain genres and styles genuinely are being pushed forward by games like this. AI will never stop advancing, and I'd say The Last of Us is a landmark title in that evolution, if only because it was such a large part of the conversation about the game. There is one other way in which The Last of Us tries to establish a consistent tone through gameplay which I'm just as conflicted on. Joel has a healthy amount of weapon sway, and this is something that's hard to reconcile when talking purely in gameplay terms. Aiming a weapon in a game is a considerably more important skill when ammo is severely limited. In your average modern shooter, the player is pretty much drowned in ammo. It's not intended to be limiting. The counter is only there because that's how guns work in real life, and making it a non-element is easier than rethinking preconceptions. In Uncharted, just as an easily accessible example, the actual act of aiming is extremely simplistic because of this plentiful ammunition. Aim in the general direction of an enemy and shoot. If you miss, no worries, you're not wasting much, aside from your own time. In The Last of Us, especially on higher difficulties, ammo drops are so scarce that every shot really truly does count. This makes proper aiming necessary. It becomes a skill to be developed over the course of the game, one that you need to learn in order to make all your bullets useful. In Uncharted, not all your bullets needed to be useful, so sloppy aiming was totally forgiven from beginning to end. Joel's weapon sway complicates this. It's not entirely random, it follows a pattern, but it's never possible to predict which direction the weapon will sway in next. The end result is that Joel's aim is always moving slightly away from where the player has placed it with the analog stick. This creates a sense of twitchiness to the gunplay. You need to fire the moment the reticle is aimed at your target before Joel's aim starts to sway away. To me, this is a lot like the run and gun controls in Uncharted. It adds depth in a sense because you're wrestling with an opposing force, but it's a sort of awkward depth which feels unpleasant even when you're playing well. The difference is that in The Last of Us, this is the point. You're supposed to just narrowly miss a shot every now and then because of the sway. Naughty Dog want you to miss every so often, so you feel the sting of that wasted bullet. It's impossible to separate the weapon sway from The Last of Us's tone. It's the one gameplay element inseparable from the presentation and realism. I'm somewhere in the middle on this. I think it comes uncomfortably close to randomness, meaning the outcome of a shot isn't always totally down to player skill, but at the same time the awkward feel of the gunplay might be a good incentive to try out some of the other options. I'm more firmly opposed to it in multiplayer modes. Of course, the weapon sway can be eliminated with some scavenged resources, which add some small dose of gameplay relevance to the walkie-talkie bits which return from Uncharted in full force. The Last of Us features a hell of a lot of walking from A to B. I said in the Uncharted video I consider these more story sections than gameplay, and that holds true here. But there have been some incentives added to these sections which encourage exploration by relating back to gameplay. It's no secret Naughty Dog puts a hell of a lot of effort into their environments, and even less so that they want you to look at them.
But man, Can't deny that view.
The Last of Us cleverly motivates players who usually wouldn't care about that aspect of design to pore over every inch of the game anyway with the crafting and scavenging systems. Every environment will yield scrap for use in weapon upgrades, pills to upgrade Joel himself, or various other haberdasheries to craft offensive items. The genius here is that this is all optional. You could race through The Last of Us in 7 or 8 hours on hard if you ignored the environments completely. This would limit your resources, but if you're the kind of gamer who doesn't give a shit about environmental design or graphics, then you're probably also the kind of gamer who can handle the extra challenge. Without this system, I would never have found some of the game's more poignant moments of environmental storytelling, and if Naughty Dog are to continue making intricately detailed games, I'd like to see them create relevant collectibles like this, instead of the utterly useless treasures of Uncharted.
Jesus.
Speaking of that environmental storytelling, it's time for another installment of Novacanoo's self-indulgent semantics paragraph. This is environmental storytelling. This is exposition given from the perspective of the person being exposed. No doubt it's incredibly difficult to tell a story as complex as Ishmael's without words, but I'd like to see this kind of thing done even more organically. If I have to read multiple pages of text to piece together a handful of visual cues, I might as well read a picture book. On a similar note, pressing triangle to initiate some in-engine dialogue is not storytelling through gameplay, it's storytelling on top of gameplay. You could say this gives further incentive to explore, this time a story or dialogue incentive rather than a gameplay one, but this doesn't even dent the concrete wall between gameplay and story. And to clarify, that's fine. I'm only worried about story interfering with gameplay. If they can interact and affect each other without sacrifice to gameplay, that's awesome. But if they just coexist, that's perfectly acceptable too. And that ends this installment of Novacanoo's self-indulgent semantics paragraph. So that's combat in The Last of Us, or at least that's most of it. This is every element of the gameplay in the main game which applies across every difficulty. The Last of Us has a single-player DLC pack, and a couple of features of the main game start disappearing as you delve into higher difficulties. Because most of this footage is from grounded mode, there's not really any way to smoothly segue into some of these topics, so I'm just going to list some stuff here and shoot off into some scattered thoughts. The Last of Us features finite healing, and by extension health packs. As I said at the beginning of the video, I did a no health pack run on the highest difficulty because I knew it was possible, and I think that fact alone is awesome. I'll admit, the game does give you one free kit, and I did use it near the end of summer. I promise I didn't craft any, and I'll come back to that. The Last of Us usually features a heads-up display which looks like this. The main aim of grounded mode, aside from making the game generally harder by tweaking numbers, is to make this game about mushroom zombies more realistic. There's no HUD, and at the start of the game Joel can take no more than 3 bullets before dying, usually 2. By the end of the game, fully upgraded, he might be lucky to take 4. I wouldn't say hiding basic information like health and ammo from the player is a good way to make a game harder, but you really don't need a HUD here. If you've taken damage at all, Joel will probably be holding his side, and at that point the next hit is death guaranteed. You'll find so few bullets in this mode that you'll probably be able to hold all the numbers in memory. You will never ever have full ammo stores for any weapon, and more than likely never even a full clip for anything either. I'm iffy on the ammo counter, but what I think is awesome about the health system is that this difficulty is even possible. Every single hit you take in The Last of Us will always be your fault, despite the fact that bullets are hit scan. When an enemy first sees Joel, they'll usually miss. This bullet isn't actually dangerous in any way whatsoever, it's an effect tied to a flinching animation on Joel to give you a chance to react and quickly get out of the line of fire. There will only ever be a second, actually damaging bullet if you're in the wrong. If you try to bull rush the enemy, if you don't quickly find some cover, or if you've positioned yourself way out in the open where several other enemies can also see you. If an enemy is aiming at your last known location, they'll hit you with the first bullet when you pop back up, but in that case all you need to do is move around a little. By giving enemies semi-automatic weapons at best, and attaching some warning and common sense logic to how enemies react and aim, Naughty Dog have finally reached a goal that goes as far back as Jak 2. They've made the combination of finite health and hit scan weapons totally, completely fair. More obvious than the intricacies of damage is the removal of Listen mode on higher difficulties. Listen mode lets the player see through walls. That's not an exaggeration. In gameplay terms, Joel can just see through walls. This gives the player a massive advantage, and I'm sort of in the middle on this one too. Some might find it shatters the tension, but for me it just makes the game way too easy. I'm glad it can be turned off on any difficulty, because it makes the gameplay totally uninteresting to me when I can see every enemy at all times. There's no considering whether or not an enemy might have flanked, no mental gymnastics, no need to foresee every possible surprise attack. It's an accessibility concern so that Naughty Dog's Oscar bait could be beaten by a wider audience, and since the rest of the gameplay doesn't suffer from that same paring back, I'm not going to mark the game down for including it. I'm happy to turn Listen mode off and turn my headphones on. I said at the beginning of the video that while the gameplay and story don't interact with one another very often, I don't believe one had a detrimental effect on the other either. The best possible example of this I could ever provide would be the Left Behind DLC, where you play exclusively as Ellie. This is quite literally divided right down the middle into gameplay and story. There are 6 chapters intercut with one another. 3 with Ellie in the quarantine zone, and 3 with Ellie trying to find medical supplies for Joel. The former exists purely for storytelling. If we accept that walkie-talkie bits are story and combat is gameplay, there is no gameplay here except the couple of games Ellie and Riley play. It's more or less a walking simulator to flesh out the characters. And I don't think that has to be a derogatory term, it's just one way of presenting a story with some small amount of interactivity without worrying about rule sets or mechanics. The other half exists entirely to give the DLC some combat. It plugs one possible plot hole in the main story, but other than that, it's exclusively here to present one new twist on gameplay. I mentioned earlier that infected and human enemies are never encountered at the same time, in the main game. Naughty Dog tested out here briefly, and while it's cool to set the enemies against each other thematically, it doesn't amount to much in gameplay terms. You throw a bottle, the infected charge the humans, one group kills the other. In the end, all the player has to do is wait, and then proceed as in any other human or infected encounter depending on who won. You could say this adds some replayability since the outcome isn't always the same, but this situation happens 3 times in the DLC, and I think that's about as long as the novelty lasts. If The Last of Us 2 does happen, and it's looking pretty likely, I'd like to see some encounters where the player is actually forced to deal with humans and infected at the same time in open combat. Here, you can just stay in stealth while they kill each other. Making that work well would also be a pretty solid achievement in terms of AI. Some of the game's other gamiest moments are the shiv doors, which require one full shiv to open and always grant boons. These are always worth opening since they contain an unusual amount of supplies, and they suggest again that nothing was sacrificed for the sake of the story. An overthinking creative director probably would have seen these as gamey and unrealistic in a game about mushroom zombies. I really like the shiv limitation on clickers. They can already kill you in one hit, and they're made even more dangerous because they require the use of some resource or another to kill. They can't be strangled or beaten at fisticuffs. The shiv doors actually have an interesting effect on higher difficulties. On Survivor and Grounded, there are only just enough blades lying around to make 13 shivs, one for each door. This means that clickers can't be stealth killed if you want to open all the doors, and that nail bombs can't be crafted. This is where Grounded difficulty both stumbles and shines. The player is given such limited resources that they have to use every single one of their options extremely efficiently. On hard, survival scavenging might encourage resource hoarding in some players. I don't have much ammo for my revolver, so I'll save it for a more difficult encounter, which then never comes and you finish the game having barely used the revolver. On even lower difficulties, you get so much ammo that you never need to explore your other options at all. Anyone who's ever called The Last of Us just Uncharted with zombies probably played the game on normal and was given enough ammo to play it like any other linear shooter. Of course, I don't blame them for that. It's Naughty Dog's fault that the suggested difficulty is not the one which gives best representation to the combat system. Grounded gives so few resources that you have to make use of every one. As much as you want to hold on to that nail bomb, you simply don't have the bullets left to take everyone out without using it. It also takes away some of the easier options. You can't stealth kill clickers if you want to open those shiv doors, so you've got to get resourceful. Which removes options, sure, but removes the easiest options, very elegantly raising the difficulty. This is also where the difficulty presents some problems though. Near the end of the summer chapter, there's a long string of battles which mandate killing everyone, rather than just sneaking past. Some of these allow you to kill everyone with stealth, but often you'll be forced into open conflict. This can lead to scenarios like this, where you have 5 bullets and a nail bomb and have to kill 8 or 9 hunters. This took me so long that I actually deleted some of the footage to make room on my hard drive for the rest of the playthrough. The game does not give you any graces here. No health or ammo boosts after dying 5 times, none of that. The Last of Us is at its best when it's giving you lots of options to choose from wisely, and on every other difficulty it does this extremely well, but it's at its worst when it's whittling away your offensive options and taking away your stealth options. The absolute worst example of this is one particular fight in Winter. Playing as Ellie removes some of your weapons, resets your ammo reserves to Naughty Dog's predetermined levels, and lowers your health. Ellie also can't perform stealth kills at all. She has an unbreakable switchblade but has to jump noisily onto an enemy's back to kill them. Ellie's weapon loadout isn't as packed full of options as Joel's, but she makes for a nice change because of the other differences. The lower health pushes you towards a more stealthy approach, but at the same time, you don't have your usual silent kill options. This is an interesting dilemma. Your only true stealth option is the bow, so you're going to need to either get really good with that, or go into open combat with an uncomfortably low amount of health. She's only used for about 4 battles, so she makes for a good change of pace by taking you out of your comfort zone while still using most of the same basic combat mechanics as Joel. Where this absolutely does not work on Grounded, however, is in the infected battle with David. Here, similar to the nighttime battle earlier, I had 2 arrows, 2 bullets, 1 Molotov and 1 nail bomb, and was expected to take out 15 infected and a bloater. And getting hit once meant instant death. On Grounded, enemies sometimes drop a single bullet for the weapon you're using when you run out of ammo, but only sometimes. The idea here ended up being to memorize enemy spawn points, kill them, and then run over to their bodies to grab that single bullet, rinse and repeat. This was of course a flawed solution because ammo drops are random, and you can just as easily end up with no bullets and have to run around chucking beer bottles at the pack of zombies that's about to eat you. I beat it, don't get me wrong, it took me half an hour, but this is the point where the difficulty is just unreasonable. There simply aren't enough options outside of guns when the game forces you into extended combat for ammo to be limited this harshly. I enjoy Grounded difficulty because I find it pretty incredible that it's even possible to beat the game with such a tiny pool of health, but I'd never say it strikes the best balance. I'd say hard does, with listen mode turned off as a matter of taste. Your options won't be so restricted, but you'll still find few enough resources that you'll need to use most of them wisely. You can spare the odd shiv for a clicker, but you still need to make almost every shot count. When talking about the story in The Last of Us, people will often say that it's a familiar, somewhat cliched post-apocalyptic story which is told extremely well. The acting and dialogue, the characters are what elevates it, not the events of the plot. I'd say exactly the same about the gameplay. It's a soup of familiar action game mechanics executed extremely well. It's not the deepest game ever, and certainly not the most creative, but all the pieces come together with an elegance and clarity which is rarely seen. Stealth, crafting, scavenging, third-person shooting, and light RPG elements are nothing we haven't seen before, but it's the way that all these parts are made integral and weave in and out of each other which is exceptional. If you want to play a game which uses these exact same elements and comes off feeling utterly derivative with no identity of its own, play The Evil Within. The Last of Us doesn't take a lot of risks, but not every game has to. Instead, it takes a bunch of very familiar elements and combines them into an uncommon whole. It takes all the action game mechanics we'd gotten roundly sick of by the end of the PS3 generation, and shows that a solid combat system actually can come of it. I'd call it a swan song, if it hadn't inspired several more years of the same mechanics it farewells. The Last of Us plays like a lot of games, but no games play quite like The Last of Us. Tell you the truth, I had to muster some serious enthusiasm to give The Last of Us the analysis I felt it deserved. I really do like this game a hell of a lot, but I've played it so many times now that this efficient, grounded mode playthrough felt a bit clinical. That's not the game's fault, it has to be doing something right for me to want to play it 10 times through. What I've never gotten sick of, though, is the multiplayer. I never played it in Uncharted 2 and 3, so I couldn't comment, but multiplayer modes are often worthy of their own video anyway, not just a couple paragraphs as an afterthought. I did play it in The Last of Us, though, a hell of a lot. It's probably my second or third most played multiplayer mode of all time. I don't play an incredible amount of multiplayer, I admit, but I've played enough to know that, above everything else, Factions is supremely well balanced. I don't want to go into it more than that right now, it's on the list for a separate video, eventually, not soon, but I did want to ask for some audience participation this time. The servers are dying for this 3-year-old game, and I'd love to get some more PSN friends together who love the multiplayer just as much as I do, or are willing to devote some time to giving it a go. Message me on Twitter and I'll let you know my PlayStation ID. This is the PS4 version, by the way. I hope you all watched in 60 frames. If we can get a dozen people together, we never need to worry about server numbers again.